I've always believed that love could overcome anything. You know, the whole love conquers all thing? That was me. I thought if you loved someone enough, you could get through anything together. But looking back, maybe I was just naive. Love can be powerful, but it's not always enough, and sometimes, it's a lot messier than you'd ever expect. This story isn't some fairy tale, and it sure as hell doesn't have a happy ending. I wish it did. I wish things could have been different. But here it is, just as it happened. It all started when I met Brian. We were both in college, just a couple of kids trying to figure out what the hell we were doing with our lives. I was 20, and he was a year older. We met through some mutual friends, and from the first moment, there was this spark between us. You know that feeling when you just know someone's going to be important in your life? That was Brian for me. Brian wasn't like anyone I'd ever met before. He was kind, patient, and funny in this understated way that made me feel like he really understood me. We could talk for hours about anything and everything, life, our dreams, the things that scared us. There was an ease to being with him that I'd never felt with anyone else. He made me feel seen, really seen, in a way that no one else ever had. We started dating pretty much right away, but we kept it quiet. See, there was one huge complication in all of this, my stepdad, Mike. Mike was, well, he was complicated. He'd married my mom when I was 15, and he always tried to be this super strict, controlling figure in my life. At first, I thought it was because he cared, but as time went on, I realized it was more about control than anything else. Mike was the kind of guy who believed in rules. He had this rigid view of how the world should work, and he expected everyone around him to fall in line. My mom, bless her heart, tried her best to keep the peace, but she was always caught in the middle. Mike and I never really got along. We tolerated each other, but there was always this underlying tension, this unspoken battle for control. Mike never liked the idea of me dating anyone. He was the kind of guy who thought no one would ever be good enough for me, but not in a protective, loving way. More like he didn't want anyone else to have any say in my life but him. So, when Brian and I started seeing each other, we decided to keep it a secret. I didn't want to deal with Mike's inevitable outburst, and I didn't want Brian to have to deal with it either. For the first few months, things were perfect. Brian and I would sneak around, meeting up whenever we could. It was thrilling, in a way, like we were two spies on some kind of secret mission. Every kiss, every touch, every moment we had together felt like it was stolen from the rest of the world. We had our own little bubble, a place where it was just the two of us, free from the outside world and its complications. I loved him, and I really thought we were going to make it. But secrets have a way of catching up with you. And ours did, in the worst possible way. It was a Friday night, and my mom had gone out of town for the weekend to visit her sister. Mike had been on a business trip for the past week and wasn't supposed to be back until Sunday. So, naturally, I invited Brian over. We spent the whole day together, just the two of us. We went out for a bit, grabbed some food, and then came back to my place to hang out. It felt good, having the house to ourselves. For once, we didn't have to worry about sneaking around or getting caught. I remember the way Brian looked at me that day, like I was the only person in the world that mattered. We spent the afternoon in my room, just talking, laughing, and eventually, things got, well, you can probably guess where things went from there. It wasn't the first time we'd been together like that, but there was something different about it that day. Maybe it was because we were finally able to just be ourselves, without the constant fear of getting caught. It felt real in a way that was almost overwhelming. I remember lying there afterward, my head resting on Brian's chest, feeling like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. We were lying in bed together when we heard the front door slam. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. Mike wasn't supposed to be home yet. But then I heard his voice, calling my name. My heart stopped. Brian looked at me, his eyes wide with panic. We both knew there was no way out of this. Mike's footsteps pounded up the stairs, getting closer and closer to my room. I barely had time to throw on a t-shirt before the door burst open. Mike stood there in the doorway, his face red with anger, his eyes blazing as he took in the scene before him. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted. I tried to stammer out an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. Brian was frozen beside me, not sure whether to stand up or stay where he was. Mike's gaze shifted from me to Brian, and I could see the rage building in him, like a volcano about to erupt. "You." Mike pointed at Brian. "Get out. Now." Brian didn't move. I think he was just as scared as I was, but he didn't want to leave me alone with Mike in that state. "Get out!" Mike roared, taking a step towards Brian. Brian finally scrambled out of bed, grabbing his clothes and heading for the door. He shot me a worried look, but I shook my head slightly. There was no point in arguing with Mike when he was like this. Brian left without another word, leaving me alone with the storm that was about to hit. Mike turned back to me, his face twisted in anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Jenny? Bringing some guy into this house? Have you lost your mind?" I tried to speak, to defend myself, but he cut me off. "I've put up with a lot from you over the years, but this? This is too much. You're out of control, and I'm not going to tolerate it anymore." His words stung, but I refused to let him see how much they hurt. "I'm 20 years old, Mike. I'm an adult. I can see whoever I want. Not under my roof, you don't," he shot back. "If you're going to act like some slut, then you can get the hell out of my house." I felt like I'd been slapped. I'd never seen him this angry before. Sure, he'd had his moments, but this was different. It was like something had snapped inside him, and I was the one who'd pushed him over the edge. "Fine," I said, my voice shaking with anger and fear. "I'll leave. But you should know something first." Mike glared at me, his eyes narrowing. "What?" I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should really go through with it. But then I remembered all the times Mike had made my life hell, all the times he tried to control me, to manipulate me. And I made my decision. "I know about the videos," I said quietly. For a moment, Mike looked confused, like he didn't understand what I was talking about. But then his face went pale, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. What videos?" he stammered. "The ones you keep hidden in your office. The ones of you and her." I didn't have to say who her was. We both knew. My mom's best friend, Linda. They'd been having an affair for years, and Mike had been stupid enough to record some of their encounters. I'd stumbled across the videos by accident a few months earlier, and I'd kept quiet about it. Until now. Mike's face turned a sickly shade of green. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. For the first time since I'd known him, he was speechless. "You kick me out," I said, "and I'll show those videos to Mom. Hell, I'll show them to the whole town. How do you think that'll go over, huh?" For a moment, I thought he might actually hit me. His fists clenched, his jaw tightened, and his eyes burned with a fury I'd never seen before. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the anger drained out of him. He sank down onto the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "You wouldn't do that," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Try me," I shot back. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity. I could see the gears turning in Mike's head as he tried to figure out his next move. But he knew he was trapped. If he pushed me out, I'd take him down with me. And he couldn't afford to let that happen. Finally, he let out a long, shaky breath. "Fine. You can stay. But this thing with Brian? It ends. Now." "No," I said firmly. "I'm not breaking up with him." Mike's eyes flashed with anger again, but he was too defeated to argue. "You're making a mistake, Jenny. He's not worth it." "That's not your decision to make," I said, my voice cold. Another long silence stretched between us. I could see the pain in Mike's eyes, the realization that he'd lost control. And in that moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "You should go," I finally said. "I don't want to see you right now." Mike didn't argue. He stood up, his movements slow and weary, like an old man. Without another word, he walked out of my room, closing the door softly behind him. As soon as he was gone, I collapsed onto the bed, my whole body shaking. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I'd stood up to Mike, something I'd never thought I'd have the courage to do. But instead of feeling triumphant, I just felt empty. I grabbed my phone and texted Brian, telling him what had happened. He called me right away, his voice full of concern. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said, even though I wasn't sure if that was true. "I'm fine. Just shaken up, I guess." "I'm so sorry, Jenny. I should have been there with you." "No, it's not your fault. I'm just glad you got out before things got really ugly." We talked for a while longer, but it was clear that the whole situation had rattled both of us. Brian promised he'd come over the next day to check on me, but I could hear the hesitation in his voice. I knew he was scared of Mike, scared of what this meant for us. The next morning, I woke up to a text from Brian. He said he was coming over, just like he'd promised, but there was something different in his tone. It was almost distant. I tried to push the feeling away, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something had changed. When Brian arrived, he was quiet, almost withdrawn. We sat on the couch together, but it felt like there was a wall between us, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I asked him what was wrong, but he just shook his head, saying he was tired, that the whole situation was just a lot to handle. I understood, of course. It was a lot to handle, for both of us. But as the days went by, that distance between us only grew. Brian started pulling away, bit by bit. He stopped coming over as much, started making excuses for why he couldn't hang out. He said he needed to focus on school, that he was just busy, but I knew the truth. He was scared. Scared of Mike, scared of what might happen if we got caught again. One night, after a week of barely hearing from him, I confronted Brian about it. We were sitting in his car outside my house, the engine idling softly in the background. "Are you breaking up with me?" I asked, my voice trembling. Brian looked at me, and I could see the pain in his eyes. He didn't want to say it, but I knew the answer before he even opened his mouth. "I don't want to," he said quietly. "But, Jenny, this whole thing with Mike, it's too much. I can't keep doing this." Tears welled up in my eyes, but I forced them back. I didn't want to cry, didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing how much this hurt. "So, that's it? You're just going to leave me?" "Jenny, please, it's not that simple. I care about you so much, but I'm scared. I'm scared of what Mike might do, of what he's capable of. I don't want to get you hurt. I don't want to get hurt." I wanted to scream at him, to tell him that he was a coward, that love was supposed to be stronger than fear. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just sat there in stunned silence as Brian reached over and gently took my hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I really am." I pulled my hand away, my heart breaking. "Just go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Jenny, please. Go." Brian hesitated for a moment, like he was going to say something else, but then he sighed, started the car, and drove away. I watched him go, feeling like my whole world had just come crashing down around me. After that, things only got worse. Mike's behavior became even more erratic. He was always watching me, always trying to control every aspect of my life. My mom noticed that something was wrong, but every time she asked, I just brushed it off, telling her that everything was fine. I didn't want to drag her into this mess. She had enough on her plate as it was, dealing with Mike and his mood swings. But one night, it all came to a head. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard my mom and Mike arguing in the kitchen. At first, I tried to ignore it, arguing had become a regular thing between them, but then I heard my mom mention something about the videos. My blood ran cold. I got up and crept towards the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest. I pressed myself against the wall, just out of sight, and listened. "I found them, Mike," my mom was saying, her voice shaking with anger. I found the videos. How could you? How could you do this to me? Mike was silent for a moment, and then I heard him let out a long, defeated sigh. I'm sorry, he said, but his voice lacked any real remorse. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. Find out? My mom spat. Find out what, Mike? That you've been cheating on me for years? That you've been sneaking around with my best friend? God, how could you be so stupid? How could you film it? I don't know, Mike muttered. It was a mistake, okay? I know I messed up, but... No, my mom cut him off. You don't get to just brush this off like it's nothing. You betrayed me, Mike. You betrayed us. I couldn't listen anymore. I turned and ran up to my room, slamming the door behind me. My whole body was shaking, and I felt like I was going to be sick. My mom had found the videos. She knew everything. And now, everything was about to fall apart. I sat on my bed, staring at the wall, trying to make sense of it all. How had things gotten so messed up? How had my life turned into this nightmare? I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fix this. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. I tensed up, half expecting Mike to burst into my room, but it was my mom. She opened the door slowly, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she'd just aged 10 years in the span of a few minutes. Jenny, she said quietly. We need to talk. I nodded numbly and gestured for her to come in. She sat down on the edge of my bed, her hands trembling in her lap. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things that were left unsaid. Finally, my mom spoke. I know about the videos, Jenny. I know everything. I looked at her, my heart pounding. Mom, I'm so sorry. She shook her head, cutting me off. It's not your fault. I should have seen the signs, should have known something was wrong. But I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that Mike was capable of something like this. Tears welled up in my mom's eyes, and she wiped them away angrily. I loved him, Jenny. I really did. But now, I don't even know who he is anymore. I didn't know what to say, so I just sat there in silence, my own tears threatening to spill over. I'd always been so angry at my mom for staying with Mike, for not seeing how toxic he was. But now, I just felt sorry for her. She'd been blindsided, betrayed by the one person she thought she could trust. What are you going to do? I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know if I can forgive him for this. But part of me still loves him, Jenny. Part of me doesn't want to let go. I didn't understand how she could still feel that way after everything that had happened, but I didn't say anything. It wasn't my place to judge her feelings. All I could do was be there for her, support her in whatever decision she made. For the next few days, the house was tense. Mike and my mom barely spoke to each other, and when they did, it was like they were walking on eggshells. I tried to stay out of their way, but it was hard. The atmosphere was suffocating, like a dark cloud hanging over us all. Eventually, Mike moved out. He didn't say goodbye to me, didn't even look at me as he packed his things and left. Part of me was relieved, but another part of me was, I don't know, maybe sad? Sad that it had all come to this, that my family had been torn apart in such an ugly way. My mom filed for divorce not long after that. She tried to stay strong, tried to put on a brave face, but I could see how much it was tearing her apart. She'd lost not only her husband but her best friend, too. Linda had moved away after the scandal broke, and my mom was left to pick up the pieces on her own. As for Brian, we never really recovered from what happened. We tried to stay in touch, tried to work things out, but the distance between us was too great. He'd been scared off by everything that had happened, and I couldn't blame him for that. In the end, we broke up for good, and I was left feeling more alone than ever. Looking back, I don't know if there was anything I could have done differently. Maybe if I'd been more careful, if I'd kept things with Brian even more secret, things wouldn't have spiraled out of control the way they did. But maybe it was inevitable. Maybe some things are just meant to fall apart. In the end, love didn't conquer all. It wasn't enough to keep Brian and me together, and it wasn't enough to save my mom and Mike's marriage. Sometimes, love just isn't enough. And that's the hardest lesson I've ever had to learn.